Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving into a pivotal moment in American history, James Buchanan's presidency, specifically 1857 to 61.
And our main focus is going to be that, well, explosive Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court decision. It landed right as he took office.
Yeah, a huge event. We've pulled together some key sources for this.
That's right. We've got excerpts from the National Archives on the case itself, Buchanan's Wikipedia page for background, his Miller Center page, which covers domestic policy.
And also an overview of the cultural feeling, the landscape during his presidency.
Exactly.
And our mission here is pretty clear. We want to understand the core pieces and really the huge implications of that Dred Scott ruling.
And how it just cranked up the tension during Buchanan's term, pushing things closer to the Civil War.
Definitely. So let's get right into it. The Dred Scott decision. What was the absolute heart of the case the court was looking at?
Well, fundamentally, you had Dred Scott, an enslaved man, suing for his freedom. His argument was based on time he'd spent living with his owner in territories where slavery was actually banned by Congress.
Right. And the court's decision, this was under Chief Justice Taney, it wasn't just about Scott himself, was it? It went much broader.
Oh, absolutely. Much broader. The ruling had several really key findings.
Yeah.
First, and maybe the biggest bombshell, they declared that anyone of African descent whose ancestors were brought here and sold into slavery simply wasn't a citizen as defined by the Constitution.
Wow. So what did that mean practically? That Dred Scott and really all Black people, enslaved or free, couldn't even sue in federal court?
That's exactly it. The court said that when the Constitution was adopted, these individuals just weren't considered part of the people or citizens.
So no rights, no protections under the Constitution, including the right to bring a case to federal court.
Precisely. Which meant, procedurally, the lower court, the circuit court, didn't even have jurisdiction to hear Scott's case in the first place.
That's just a fundamental denial of legal standing. But it didn't stop there, right? They also tackled the whole slavery in the territories issue. That's where it got really explosive.
It really did. The court basically said the Constitution saw enslaved people as property. Simple as that, in their view.
Okay.
And building on that, they ruled Congress had zero constitutional power to stop citizens from taking their property, and yes, they explicitly meant slaves, into any U.S. territory.
So any law trying to ban slavery in the territories
was unconstitutional. An overreach, infringing on private property rights, according to Taney's court.
So this effectively kills the Missouri Compromise, all those attempts to balance free and slave states as the country expanded.
Completely. Gutted it. Their interpretation was that the part of the Constitution letting Congress make rules for territories. That only applied to the original land from the 13 states.
Not to anything acquired later, like the Louisiana Purchase?
Nope, not in their views. So Congress trying to ban slavery there?
Invalid? What about the fact that Scott had lived in free territory? Didn't that count for anything?
The court said no. His time in free territory didn't make him free when he went back to Missouri.
Why not?
They deferred to Missouri state courts, and Missouri precedent said your status depended on the law of the state where you currently lived. So back in Missouri, he was still enslaved.
The court really hammered this point about who counted as a citizen back when the Constitution was written. What was the reasoning there?
They argued people of the United States and citizens meant the same thing, the sovereign political body.
Okay.
And they explicitly stated that the Declaration of Independence's famous line, all men are created equal, well, it just wasn't intended to include people of African descent.
That's quite an assertion. To say a foundational ideal didn't apply to a whole group of people, what evidence did they use for such a controversial take?
They pointed to old colonial laws. Things like Maryland in 1717, Massachusetts 1705.
What did those laws do?
Well, they set up barriers, banning interracial marriage, harsher punishments for Black people than white people for similar offenses, stuff like that.
And they said similar laws existed even after independence.
Yes, they pointed to laws in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, passed after the Revolution as proof that this inferior status was widely accepted and intended at the time the Constitution was framed.
Did they use the Constitution itself to back this up?
They did. They highlighted the clauses about allowing the slave trade to continue until 1808 and the Fugitive Slave Clause.
Arguing these showed the founders saw slaves purely as property.
Exactly. As property, not people with rights, not citizens. They also shot down the idea you could be a citizen but maybe not have all rights, like voting. They said citizenship rights were inherent. States couldn't just pick and choose which ones to grant.
It feels like they covered every possible angle, even down to procedural stuff.
They really tried to make it airtight. They even distinguished between appeals from state courts versus federal circuit courts, saying they had broader review powers for the federal ones.
And the final verdict on Scott's case itself.
Because he wasn't a citizen, he couldn't sue in federal court. Therefore, the circuit court never should have heard the case. No jurisdiction. Case dismissed on those grounds, essentially.
It's easy to get lost in the legal arguments, but we shouldn't forget the actual people involved.
No, definitely not. It was Dred Scott, but also his wife, Harriet, and their daughters, Eliza and Lizzie.
Right.
Harriet was also enslaved, taken to Fort Snelling Free Territory, where she and Dred married. Eliza was born on a steamboat in free waters. Lizzie later in Missouri.
Yeah.
Their lives were completely caught up in this.
And this huge, controversial decision lands square in the lap of a new president, James Buchanan, in 1857. What was his background on slavery before this?
Buchanan had a long political history. Secretary of State, senator, representative from Pennsylvania.
And
He was a big states' rights guy, especially on slavery. He really believed Congress shouldn't meddle, not in states, not in territories. He favored popular sovereignty.
letting the settlers in each territory decide for themselves.
Exactly. Let them vote on it.
So what was Buchanan's initial take on Dred Scott? Did he see it coming?
Well, it's interesting. In his inaugural address, just days before the decision was officially announced, he basically alluded to it.
Really? What did he say?
He expressed this hope, this belief, that the Supreme Court was about to settle the slavery question once and for all, permanently.
Wow. That seems incredibly optimistic, maybe even naive, given what happened next. How do historians generally see the impact of Dred Scott?
Oh, the consensus is pretty solid. It's seen as a major disaster.
A disaster.
Yeah, something that just poured gasoline on the fire. It inflamed tensions massively and is seen as a direct contributor to the Civil War. David Blight calls 1857 a great pivot towards war, largely because of the fear and mistrust this case generated.
And Buchanan, taking office right then, did he try to manage the situation? Maybe through his cabinet picks?
He did try to put together a cabinet that, balanced different factions within the party and the country. But the divisions over slavery were just too deep by then. Political appointments couldn't fix it. His whole presidency really became about trying and failing to manage this escalating crisis.
And it wasn't just the legal fallout. The culture, the mood of the country was shifting dramatically too, right? John Brand comes into the picture here.
Absolutely. Dred Scott infuriated the North because it basically opened all territories to slavery. Then, bam, 1859, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry.
That must have sent shockwaves.
Huge shockwaves. In the South, it was seen as absolute proof that the North wanted to start a massive slave uprising. Buchanan, for his part, fully supported putting down Brown's raid forcefully.
But Brown wasn't seen that way everywhere, was he?
Not at all. While the South saw a terrorist, many Northern abolitionists started seeing him as a hero, maybe even a martyr for the cause.
So two completely different narratives emerging.
Exactly. It just hardened those sexual identities. North versus South, each with their own story about slavery, freedom, and what Brown's raid meant. Meanwhile, the abolitionist movement kept pushing. The Underground Railroad was active.
Harriet Tubman.
Figures like her, yes.
Yeah.
And in the South, the defense of slavery became even more entrenched, more aggressive. You can feel this sort of growing sense of doom in the culture of the time.
Fast forward a bit. Lincoln gets elected in 1860. Secession talk explodes. Buchanan is still president in this lame duck period.
Yeah.
How did he respond?
It was a really difficult position. In his last big message to Congress, December 1860, he took this line that, he said states didn't have the right to secede legally, but he also claimed the federal government didn't have the power to stop them if they tried.
That sounds contradictory, or at least unhelpful.
It was widely criticized, yeah. And he blamed the whole crisis mostly on the North, on what he called their intemperate interference with slavery in the South.
Did he offer any solutions, any last-minute attempts to hold things together?
He proposed a constitutional amendment. Basically, it would guarantee slavery where it existed, strengthen fugitive slave laws, and lock in popular sovereignty for territories.
How did that go over?
Not well. North condemned his inaction on secession. South felt he wasn't fully backing their right to leave. It satisfied nobody.
And this pressure was tearing apart his own administration.
It was. His Treasury Secretary, Howell Cobb, resigned right after that speech, said their views were just irreconcilable.
Wow.
And as states started seceding, Buchanan was seen as, ineffective. Calls for action from the North went largely unheeded. Even in the election, the Democratic Party split, and he only gave lukewarm support to Breckinridge. Though, interestingly, 3 states did join the Union during his term: Minnesota, Oregon, and Kansas, right at the very end.
It's strange Buchanan himself was a Northerner from Pennsylvania, but his policies often seemed pro-South.
Yeah, that's why anti-slavery Northerners called him a doughface. It meant Northerner with Southern principles.
What were his personal beliefs about slavery?
It's a bit complex. He said he personally opposed it, thought it was morally wrong, but he truly believed the abolitionists were making things worse, that their agitation was counterproductive, actually delaying eventual gradual emancipation.
And he had some interesting views on how enslaved people were treated.
He did. He publicly suggested that generally they were treated with kindness and humanity. He put it down to the master's philanthropy and also just self-interest in keeping their property healthy.
That's a view that sounds jarring today, to say the least.
Very much so.
Okay, so let's step back. We've looked at Dred Scott, Buchanan's presidency, the rising tensions. What are the big takeaways for us looking back now?
Well, I think it's undeniable that the Dred Scott decision, which was really grounded in the racial views and property ideas of the time the Constitution was written, it just blew the divide between North and South wide open. And Buchanan's presidency is really defined by his struggle with that crisis, his reliance on legal arguments, his ultimate inability to stop the slide into war.
And the legacy of this whole period. Dred Scott still casts a long shadow, doesn't it?
It really does. It's such a stark reminder of how deep racial inequality ran in American history, and frankly, the terrible costs of not facing up to fundamental moral and political conflicts.
And the fact it was overturned later?
Yes, by the 13th and 14th Amendments after the Civil War. That whole process highlights the nation's long and frankly still ongoing struggle towards a more just society.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given how entrenched beliefs were back then, the legal thinking, the economic interest, could any president or any different court ruling have actually prevented the Civil War?
Or were the tensions just too deep? Was the conflict unavoidable by that point?
What does this really painful chapter tell us about how much or maybe how little politics and law can do when faced with these really profound social and moral clashes?
Something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.